If Southerners were so pro-slavery, why did they choose many anti-slavery generals like Robert E. Lee? Robert E. Lee believed slavery was wrong, but that people embracing Christian notions of love would over time get rid of it.
Robert E. Lee, like many Southerners of his time, held complex views on slavery. While it's true that he believed slavery was morally wrong and that it was a practice that should be phased out over time, he also believed that it was a necessary evil that was protected by the Constitution, and that secession was necessary to preserve the institution of slavery. Lee's decision to join the Confederate Army was driven by a sense of loyalty to his home state of Virginia, which had seceded from the Union, and by a belief that the Confederacy was fighting for states' rights and for the preservation of the Southern way of life, which was closely tied to slavery. It's also worth noting that many Confederate leaders, including military officers, held conflicting views on slavery and the Confederacy's cause. Some saw the war as a struggle to defend slavery and the Southern way of life, while others saw it as a fight to preserve states' rights and independence from the federal government. The motivations of individual Confederate leaders and soldiers were often complex and shaped by a variety of factors, including their personal beliefs, political views, and cultural background. Ultimately, the Confederate Army, including its leaders and soldiers, fought to preserve the Confederacy, which was an entity that was built upon and sustained by slavery. While some Confederate leaders, including Robert E. Lee, held personal beliefs that were at odds with slavery, the fact remains that the Confederacy was founded on the principles of states' rights and the protection of slavery, and its military leaders, including Lee, were instrumental in fighting to preserve those principles.
If the Confederacy was pro-slavery, why were they against reopening the international slave trade?
The Confederacy was indeed pro-slavery, but they were against reopening the international slave trade for a number of reasons. One reason was economic. The Confederacy was a new nation, and they needed to establish their legitimacy and stability, and reopening the slave trade would have been seen as destabilizing and could have damaged their relationship with other nations. The international slave trade was already illegal in the United States, and many nations of the world had signed treaties to abolish the trade. The Confederacy did not want to be seen as a rogue state that was flouting international law. Another reason was political. The Confederacy was facing opposition from anti-slavery forces both domestically and internationally, and reopening the slave trade would have only made their position more precarious. It would have been seen as a provocative act that would have further isolated the Confederacy and made it more difficult for them to gain international recognition. Finally, the Confederacy was also facing a manpower shortage. The Confederacy was heavily dependent on slave labor, and they needed to maintain and grow their slave population to support their economy. Reopening the slave trade would have meant more competition for slave labor, which would have driven up the cost of slaves and made it more difficult for plantation owners to maintain their labor force. In conclusion, the Confederacy's stance on the international slave trade was influenced by a number of factors, including economic, political, and practical considerations. They were pro-slavery, but they were against reopening the international slave trade for strategic reasons.
If Lincoln was anti-slavery, why did he offer Lee a job in the Union before the Confederates?
Lincoln did offer Robert E. Lee a command position in the Union Army prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, but this was not because of his personal feelings on slavery. Lincoln believed that the country was in peril, and he was willing to work with anyone, including former military officers from the Confederacy, to help preserve the Union. Lee declined the offer and instead chose to side with his home state of Virginia, which had seceded from the Union and joined the Confederacy. However, Lincoln held a deep respect for the military prowess of Confederate generals like Lee and is said to have been aware of the challenges he would face in fighting against him during the war.
People will doubt Lee's sincerity of being anti-slavery, but it's a position that he stated multiple times, that his family said he stated multiple times, and even many of his enemies said he shared. It's a position that didn't necessarily win him any favor in the Confederacy, and he had nothing to gain from it, and maybe even more to gain if he said he was in favor of it.
While it is true that Robert E. Lee expressed opposition to slavery, it is also true that he fought for the Confederacy, which was fighting to preserve the institution of slavery. Some argue that Lee's decision to fight for the Confederacy despite his personal views on slavery indicates a lack of sincerity or conviction in his beliefs. Others argue that Lee was torn between his loyalty to his home state of Virginia and his opposition to slavery, and that he ultimately made the wrong choice by siding with the Confederacy. Regardless of his personal views on slavery, Lee's decision to fight for the Confederacy had the effect of prolonging the institution of slavery and contributing to the suffering of enslaved people.